The 1955 visit of Yugoslavia to Dalymount Park makes its way into many good Irish memoirs from that time, and not just sporting ones. In her memoir, The Country Girl, Edna O'Brien recalled her feeling of bemusement towards Archbishop John Charles McQuaid, who had rallied the Minister for Justice, a certain Charles J. Haughey, against her novels. The negative influences with which she was obsessed, she told her readers, were British newspapers, evil literature, communism, and foreign soccer players. Now, she was referencing the visit of Yugoslavia. And similarly, you'll find the game in the memoirs of the great football men. I love that term. It's a real Dublin term, a football man. And Johnny Giles, a great football man, notes in his book, McQuaid said that Catholics are being persecuted in Yugoslavia by the communist regime, but he didn't deter about 22,000 corner boys going up to Dalymount. There's another great Dublin term you don't hear bandied about anymore, corner boys. The game is also in the memoir of Eamon Dunphy, though we'll come to that later on. That game is on my mind for two reasons. Of course, the imminent redevelopment of Dalymount Park causes one to think back on its long and storied past. And if you ask most people about the time a communist side lined out in Daly, they might think of that extraordinary 3-0 victory over the Soviet Union in 1974, the day of a Don Givens hat-trick. Then there was much talk in the press of how we'd witnessed a giant killing. The Indo told readers, Ireland comes in from the cold as a footballing nation. We had humbled the might of the Soviet Union, the second most powerful athletics nation in the world, with a brilliantly adventurous display of footballing skills that had the fans shouting their heads off till the very end. Ireland officially recognised the Soviet Union and established full diplomatic relations, believe it or not, only in September 1973, which was not long before that match. And it was 1974 before embassies opened in Dublin and Moscow. But alas, the redevelopment of Daly causes lots of nostalgic feelings for everyone who follows football in this country. And look, let's be honest, also something of a little bit of worry for the future, and a hope that the spirit of that great place isn't lost in its redevelopment. For fans of the national team, for the Bohemian faithful, whether they're old enough to have seen the great man Jackie Jemison or not, and for the Irish football community more broadly. Most of the FAI Cups that Shamrock Rovers won, they won them in Dalymount Park. I witnessed the greatest goal I suspect I'll ever see in person from its away end, Keith Fahey's long distance shot against the Bohemians team that really did seem unbeatable, struck from 35 yards. That will always be the best Pats goal, I think, that I see in person. Busby Babes graced its pitch against Shamrock Rovers. I mean, the place has history and heritage in abundance. And even if you don't like football, you might have been there to see some of those great gigs. But there's more than nostalgia at play in this episode. A brilliant new book, Cold War Football, A History in 10 Matches, from Tony Shaw and Alan McDougall, includes the 1955 fixture in it, and brilliantly kind of sets out the context of the game and others it examines. It's an academic book. It carries the imprint of Cambridge University Press, but don't be put off by that. It's also very accessible. It's readable. That's been a real trend, I think, with good university presses. They're bringing books that are, thorough, and you can find the references there, but eminently readable. And that's exactly what this book is. And it's written by people who clearly love the game of football. Few football histories draw on the archives of secret intelligence services and religious orders, or feature the extraordinary mix of the Grimsby Evening Telegraph and Soviet Weekly in the bibliography. But when I read this book and I reviewed the book in the paper, I said, look, this is a great book. I'm going to ask these lads to come on and talk a bit about this game in Dalymount Park, but also the book more broadly. So weirdly, this is the second time on this podcast you'll hear about the North Koreans in the 1966 World Cup. That football is deeply entwined with politics, that's not news to anyone, not least those in FAI headquarters at the moment, currently experiencing a sense of existential dread, I think, around October's fixtures. But here is a book where sometimes, like the North Koreans, the game could transcend politics, but at other times, as we'll hear today, matters off the pitch dominated the headlines. Cold War Football is out now. I hope you're enjoying the Insomniacs World Cup. Best of luck, of course, to Pico Lopez and the great Joseph Anang out there. For now, enjoy this edition. Picture this scene. It's May Day 1949, and you might expect to hear the red flag. O'Connell Street is thronged. There are reportedly north of 120,000 people there. Some newspapers will claim 150,000. The band of the Irish Transport and General Workers Union are there. Union banners are visible in the pictures that filled the newspapers the next day. No one's singing the red flag. And the Lord Mayor of Dublin from the Labour Party speaks. But this is no ordinary May Day. The Labour man tells the crowd that the Labour movement will never tolerate within its ranks any materialistic outlook or any propaganda against God or his holy church. I want to kill forever the lying propaganda that the Labour movement in this country is fostering communism or materialism. From the Dublin Trade Union Council, a speaker told the crowd that if communism attempted to raise its head, we had very effective ways to deal with it, and they would deal with it. Now, as May Days go, this was pretty abnormal stuff. But the cause of the enormous demonstration was, to quote the organisers of that rally, the persecution of the church in Eastern Europe. And in particular, the case of Archbishop Stepanak, convicted of treason in Yugoslavia, had driven those extraordinary numbers onto the streets and changed the political feeling within Irish Labour. That Yugoslavia's relationship with the Soviet Union, was deeply frayed, and Yugoslavia under Tito had pursued a kind of third policy against the backdrop of the Cold War, meant very little to the crowd on O'Connell Street. I mean, they viewed Yugoslavia as a place where the Catholic Church was under siege. The idea of Yugoslavia playing a football match in Ireland against that backdrop was never going to pass without significant protest. But in the 1950s, as Alan notes, UEFA was but a baby, and there was much talk of the ability of the game to transcend politics.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that if you think about the framework for the sort of Ireland Yugoslavia game in '55, previous year you'd had the founding of UEFA, 1954, and UEFA's remit was very much, it had this vision, this Europe of football idea, which was meant, unlike all of the political divisions then in Europe, whether you were East or West or neutral, it was meant to transcend those divisions and be this football, as we see in the current 2026 World Cup propaganda, football uniting all. UEFA bigwigs really believed in this. So the idea of kind of crossing political boundaries through football was maybe a bit easier, as you say, partly because of football's popularity, but also I think because it was sort of baked into the founding of UEFA that this would be a genuine pan-European organization, and in theory, the politics didn't matter. You could be a communist country, a capitalist country, and you could have membership of UEFA. So it's interesting that at the moment this game occurs between Ireland and Yugoslavia in '55. UEFA is expounding this idea.
Yugoslavia had a brilliant product in the 1950s on the football pitch. The country was young, it had deep cultural and ethnic divisions that ran through it, but football was a great unifier, and more importantly, it was a great tool of cultural diplomacy, and they were brilliant at it. They qualified for every World Cup tournament between 1950 and 1952. Their players highly rated everywhere. The state had what the book terms football as marketing strategy. And as Tony notes, there was real value for the state in bringing its brilliant football team and its football reputation to global audiences.
I mean, the case of Yugoslavia in the game in 1955, Yugoslavia, like lots of other countries, lots of other governments, were wanting to use football as a sort of public diplomacy, as a way of selling socialism, as a way of selling their way of life. So if you could go overseas and show that, football worked in the East, that football was entertaining, maybe even sort of revolutionary in the way it was played, that might indicate to people in the West that, there was something attractive about communism. That's not just the East doing that, it's Western countries doing that as well, with lots of politicians being interested in what the role of football might be as a way of advertising their ideology.
Is it possible to transcend the geopolitics of the Cold War era? Well, I mean, throughout Tony and Alan's book, there are extraordinary games that would suggest the answer to that is mostly no, but not universally. And on the podcast with Brian Kerr, Brian talked about his memories of the 1966 World Cup, going over to watch it, and the North Korean team, which captivated the British public and the wider footballing world. I think the 1966 World Cup had a massive, massive impact on football in this country too, and turned a lot of people onto the game. And it's curious in the case of that team, it was very local factors that won the hearts of people in one English city. The lads present wonderful examples in the DPRK and Hungary of teams where the beauty of the game itself won out.
Yeah, that North Korea game is a great example of that. So North Korea arrived in England in 1966 as the mystery men from the East, as the British press called them, or men from Mars. People knew even less about Kim Il-sung's North Korea than they do now, which is pretty much very little or nothing, or it gets filtered through what the Western press says. And lo and behold, this team that's expected to be a minnow, to get thrashed, manages to beat Italy, one of the favourites of the competition. They're based up in Middlesbrough, their training patch, and the people of Middlesbrough formed this extraordinary bond with the North Korean, partly because they're wearing red, the same colour as the Middlesbrough team, partly because they're small in stature and expected, therefore they're seen as natural underdogs. And also they play really quite exciting football. They go for it. They're not defensive. And so what we get by the time the quarter-final comes around, this fantastic 5-3 game against which Portugal beat them in, North Korea get beaten. Then you have thousands of people from Middlesbrough travelling down south, with North Korean flags on the trains and chanting Korea during the game at Goodson Park, and that didn't just go through to the end of the tournament. Right the way through to the present day. More recently, a number of there was a women's team from Middlesbrough more recently travelled to North Korea and played a number of games, so there's something very long-standing about that, and takes us, in other words, beyond the Cold War. So here we have football as a sort of barrier breaker.
Yeah, and you could jump in and just add the communist team from Hungary in the 50s to that list, right? If you think about sort of beloved teams in world football history, especially teams that were brilliant and beloved but didn't quite get over the line. You think of Holland in 74 and 78, you think of Hungary in 1954, a team that developed under this brutal communist dictatorship, but that was, because of its revolutionary football, because of its long unbeaten run, its brilliant players, was kind of beloved, I think, across political boundaries. Like, we have this story in the book about the Hungary team being on a train to Scotland for a game, and Bill Shankly's there with one of the teams he was coaching in the 50s. I think it was Wokinton, some lower division team, and Shanks is really excited, and he runs down the carriage to first class to go and get all the autographs for his players from the Hungarian team. So I think, to your point earlier, a lot of Hungarian music or cinema, let's say pop music, is not going to make any impact in the West. But football, which touches everybody and which the communists were quite revolutionary exponents of, is totally different ballgame.
So in a book on the Cold War, we mostly have the classic East-West kind of power struggle. But Ireland is unusual in this tale, isn't it? A nation that respected self-determination and anti-colonial struggle. It was also firmly in the anti-communist camp. And here was a country which had received Marshall aid from the US after the World War, a country which, at the time of the game with Yugoslavia, doesn't even recognise the Soviet Union. So Ireland is unusual in this, and I suppose Ireland is an interesting study in a book like this because it's not really politics you're looking at, it's fate.
Well spotted. That's why we wanted to include it. We wanted to break down this binary approach towards the Cold War, that it's, obviously the United States isn't involved in the book much because it's not a big fan of football, but want to break down this idea that powers. And Ireland does stand out as being, semi-detached perhaps from the West, but I mean, at this period, quite close to the West, the period that we're looking at, the 40s and 50s. And the chief reason we wanted to look at it was because it brought up the question of Catholicism versus communism, brought up the question of religion. We start off by talking in the book about the famous quote from Pele, comparing football to religion. I worship football, etc. And here we have an example of football and faith clashing, and God perhaps losing. So we wanted to bring up that issue of, well, what role did Catholicism play in the Cold War? And this clash between a richly Catholic country like the Republic of Ireland and Yugoslavia again. This country that's led by Tito, a man who's persecuting Catholics, was a great sort of route into that.
Anti-communism runs through Irish politics, left and right at the time. And that's important to say because I think it challenges the idea that perhaps has emerged now when we look back on Ireland in the past, that Archbishop McQuaid is this omnipotent boogeyman figure, desperate to turn the Irish public off this match. But the fact is, his feelings on Yugoslavia were, as we heard from the May Day rally, broadly mainstream feelings running through many sections of society. But whatever about that, the FAI believed football was football. And the FAI secretary, Joe Wickham, he first considered bringing Yugoslavia to Ireland earlier than this match, but McQuaid got wind of it and the plan collapsed. Now, this mattered deeply to Wickham, that McQuaid was against the idea of us playing Yugoslavia. He was a practicing Catholic. He actually had two sisters who became nuns, not entirely unusual in the Ireland of that time. And when the game for October 1955 is being put together, Wickham this time does his best to stop McQuaid hearing anything about it. When it's announced, football fans are very, very excited, and most of the coverage was where it belonged, in the back pages.
It is, yeah, because that's so it indicates that it's not just the clergy that are anti-communist. Trade unions are anti-communist in this period in Ireland, and lots of people more broadly, because of what communism is being seen to be doing against Catholicism. So, we go on to talk about the role of Archbishop McQuaid and how he tries to stop the game from happening. But he's not in a tiny minority. There are many hundreds of thousands, millions of people who are very skeptical of what communism amounts to in Ireland. But you're right, it's at a bad time. In other words, when the game is being ventured in 1952, a game first is ventured, and it's McQuaid sort of puts a halt to it. It doesn't go ahead. But in 1955, there's a major row over it, when on this occasion McQuaid and his friends in power try to stop the game from happening. This is the point when Yugoslavia, as a football team, are seen as a great powerhouse in Eastern Europe. Many people are sort of ordinary spectators. Football fans are licking their lips at the prospect of seeing the Yugoslavs. And so it's not surprising that there's a big schism in Ireland about this.
But what Tony calls the men in blazers had their showdown. The match is scheduled for Wednesday, the 19th of October, 1955. And once October arrives, McQuaid's office begin piling pressure onto not just Wickham, but also Oscar Traynor and others within the FAI. I think that was kind of a very clever move, to wait until a time when the most embarrassment could be caused. And it was Father John O'Regan, on behalf of the Archbishop, who would ring Wickham. As John Cooney, who's the author of a brilliant expert biography, one of the great biographies of modern Irish history on John Charles McQuaid, tells it, basically, the message that is communicated to the FAI is, well, there's three messages from McQuaid, and they are: Archbishop McQuaid has heard with regret that this match has been arranged. He further regretted that his views on the fixture had not been sought, as they had been in 1952. And he suggested that if it were at all possible, even at this late stage, the game might be cancelled as a protest against the persecution of the Cardinal by Marshal Tito's communist regime. Wickham had a major headache on his hands now, and it was made worse by the fact that the Department of Justice were also in a complete tizzy. They asked for the names of all 22 players and officials in the Yugoslav party, and I wanted a guarantee that the FAI, this is mad, would pay the expenses of any visiting player from Yugoslavia who might turn around and say, I'm not going back there. You know, anyone who tried to seek refugee status in Ireland. Now, remember, this is a team that have been touring the world. They played across basically every continent. Why the Department of Justice thought they would pull a stunt like that here, I don't know. The government quietly would advise the president, Sean T. O'Kelly, not to attend the game. And within the FAI, there was an insistence that this game should and would go ahead. They would hold the line.
I mean, the men in blazers are much derided in this day and age. But here we have a case of the men in blazers led by Joe Wickham, who's secretary of the FII, really being prepared to stand up to the power of the church. I don't think, I mean, they were reluctant to do this, quite rightly, because of the power of McQuaid and others. But there is a division within the FAI, but by and large, there is a majority in support of the game going ahead, even though there are effectively many threats from McQuaid and others about, for instance, oh well, if we allow what would happen if the Yugoslavs come over and they defect? You know, who's going to pay for the cost of looking after them, etc., or who's going to pay politically for the embarrassment that's caused? And you get some other members of the church saying, if the Yugoslavs do come over, we're going to try and get them to defect and embarrass the FAI and embarrass the communist Yugoslavia.
So the crowd that shows up that night is strong. It is definitely north of 20,000, probably between 20 and 22,000. The game is picketed strongly by the Legion of Mary and others. And branch men, special branch men, were not inconspicuous in the crowd. Perhaps they were fearful of violence between rival factions. I find it really interesting looking at who showed up to support the game. Dan Breen, the veteran Tipperary Republican, sometimes a great contrarian in his ways, but he showed up. I think since the days of the War of Independence, Dan had something of a strong distrust of clerical power. And in his own words, he said he showed up to, quote, fire his last shot for Ireland. But the fallout was real. The army band, like they're a mainstay feature of those fixtures at the time, they refused to play. And Philip Green, the legendary football commentator, refuses to commentate on the match. I think that really hurt the FAI. Green was born actually in the shadow of Dalymount Park and had done something unimaginable and unforgivable in Irish footballing communities, switched his allegiances from his father's Bohemians to the arch rivals Shamrock Rovers. He was a great commentator. I mean, anyone of a vintage that remembers Philip Green will never forget him. And as James Quinn writes in his entry in the Dictionary of Irish Biography, his leaning towards Rovers meant that he took considerable ribbing from followers of other teams who dubbed him Philip, Green and White. But whatever about the domestic league, Green was staying away from this one. And it felt, as Eamon Dunphy remembers it in his memoir, The Rocky Road, it felt like football itself now was under siege. Official Ireland was on a roll, Eamon writes. The soccer crowd, as they were dismissively known, were isolated. But on the day, the turnout is more than respectable, and that deserves to be remembered too.
Yeah, I think upwards of the reports suggest there were about 22,000 turned up. That's a really decent turnout, especially given the threats, in effect, that McQuaid and others had issued for people who were. So, for instance, to go back to Joe Wickham, the secretary of the FAI, he was from his local pulpit, he was called a traitor, to church and country. And so there were very clear signals coming from on high that if you go to this game, you are supporting communism, you are supporting the persecution of Catholicism. There were, again, reports of plain-clothed officers on the lookout for people, perhaps on the lookout for Yugoslav players defecting or something like that, or maybe keeping an eye out on people who weren't, who they might be fingered therefore as subversives because they were attending the game.
And the crowd, overwhelmingly, the sense that you get from the match reports, the crowd had come to see a team they had heard so much of. There's a word used describing the game that Yugoslavia play in the press, a science. The idea of football as a science, that really catches the imagination, doesn't it? And the people in Dalymount Park that day had no problem clapping the visitors off the pitch. The Yugoslav players recognised that they were amongst football people. They were lodging in the Gresham Hotel, and they remained completely silent on the issue of McQuaid's intervention. They refused to be pulled into a war of words. And I think those men who played for Yugoslavia, they had a feeling that, football was going to bring them places. It was only a very short period after that match before you had players, teams like Bologna, Bayern Munich, and beyond.
Ireland expected to get beat, and they did get beat. They got pretty much thrashed 4-1, with one of the Yugoslav stars, Milutinovic, scoring a hat-trick. A couple of the Irish players, Con Martin, who then played for Aston Villa, had a real shocker. But Yugoslav played some, and it was reported in the Irish press as a bewildering football. So some people are going to Dalymount, to send a political message or religious message. I think, let's face it, the majority are going along just to watch football. But in and of itself, of course, that's important.
One thing I really enjoyed reading this book was the emphasis on the matches themselves. By which I mean, were these games any good? I think that's a really important bit of this story, because books on football, and there's lots of books on football by historians, sociologists, beyond, they can kind of overlook the action on the field of play. And while a lot's been written about Yugoslavia in Dalyr, not many books will tell you how, for example, quote, the Irish in green had the better of the opening skirmishes. The pitch was heavier than the visitors were used to, and the Irish weather played to the hosts' advantage. We get a sense of the actual matches in this book.
Yeah, I think we talked about that sort of when we got together for this project. That, and I remember I've chatted to various sort of academics, sports historians, sociologists, and a frustration of mine has often been that where is the sport in sports history books? So academic sports history books, and often it's left out. There's theory, there's great context, there's stuff on the politics, but yeah, the game is often an afterthought. And a lot of the games that we talk about are pretty dramatic. Some of them are a bit one-sided. One of them famously doesn't happen, but they're all freighted with political meaning, but they also have dramatic moments as sort of football history as well. So, yeah, I think that was very important for both of us. And, we both love football as well. So that was easy enough to do.
So a lot of people learned something about Yugoslavia that day. Liam Toohey, a legendary football man in his own right, a player-manager who brought Shamrock Rovers to great heights, would joke about lining up for Ireland that day, looking across at Yugoslavia and the players on the other side of the tunnel blessing themselves. How it felt like there were as many Catholics on their side as ours. The boogeyman, I suppose, of Yugoslavia. The team that had been branded in the press instruments of tyranny had fallen.
I mean, the Yugoslavia, this atheistic state that's depicted in sort of the Irish press was actually, as we know, this multinational state that had many different political and religious beliefs under it, Catholicism, Serbian Orthodox, obviously a large Muslim community, all of which was kind of put mosaic-like into Yugoslavia's best football teams during the Cold War. So, again, it's that reminder that the Cold War identities, as we try and get across at various points of the book, are not necessarily fixed on the football field, that they can have different levels to them, right?
Ireland lost 4-1, but football cannot be said to have lost. And as Cooney writes in his McQuaid book, he was perhaps the real loser. I mean, his stance earned him international notoriety. Apparently there were jokes about him on the BBC. The conservative press was baffled. One Italian newspaper called him a Monsignor of olden days. In Italy, football was something that transcended politics. And as Cooney puts it so well, the long-term loser was McQuaid, who after 1955 never regained the level of respect he had enjoyed amongst the working class as a result of his social work. But sadly, one of the real impacts of the game here was at home. In the north, there was a lot of commentary on all of this. The Belfast Telegraph insisted it proved the existence of an invisible curtain of religious division here as real as the iron one. The game was a subject of much discussion at all levels of society in the north, one writer recalling it being, quote, a topic of heated conversation in the pubs and clubs of East Belfast. Now, that was hardly a utopian society itself. Today, there is much romanticism about the football teams on the other side of the Iron Curtain. I think about the retro East German football kit. So the fact you can buy a 1966 North Korean jersey, the way we can rattle off the names of some of the players of Hungary, North Korea, the Soviet Union. And I wanted to ask the lads before wrapping up, what is it that makes those teams so enduring or so exotic in our minds?
I was thinking about this at our book launch. We were signing a book for someone, and someone came up with the Duke of Prague shirt, which of course has this iconic following because of Half Man, Half Biscuit in the 80s. And so, yeah, I did. You're right. I think there is a sort of romanticism around communist era footballers, and I think it's something to do with the unattainability of it. I think nowadays, and if you think in 2026, there's nothing new under the sun, particularly for European and South American nations. I'm always shocked at this World Cup so far when I go, oh, I know that guy. He plays for, it's usually Wolves, it seems to me, in the World Cup, right? Whereas I think there was that sense of distance and mystique about some of the footballers of that era, particularly the pre-television era, to go back to what Tony was talking about, where we were reliant on newspaper reports and a little bit of newsreel footage. So I think all of that makes those players feel more exotic and strange. And then particularly, think about the Hungary team in 53 and 54, when they come in kind of with this revolutionary tactics, playing this kind of fast-moving modern football with lightweight boots, and they're actually warming up for games. I mean, all of these things just seem like they're beamed down, as some English press said in 1953, from another planet. So I think it has a bit to do with that. Plus, also generally, footballers were slightly at a distance from the politics of the day. So, some of them defected, of course, from communism. Jürgen Sparwasser, who we talk about in our chapter on the 1974 East Germany-West Germany game, eventually defects from East Germany to West Germany, actually just before the wall falls. So I think maybe they're a bit less tainted as well. That's another factor.
So thanks so much to Tony and Alan for joining me. Look, the book just weaves Cold War geopolitics and the beautiful game brilliantly. And it got me thinking about Dalymount. Whatever happens to Dalymount, I'd love to see a kind of museum of some sorts marking great games like this one in Dalymount's story, from the Busby Babes to Yugoslavia. Thank you so much as ever for tuning into the podcast. A special thank you to all of you who support it on Patreon. I'll be back soon. Until then, slán go fóill.